Avenger Field, Sweetwater, Texas, April 1944. The heat started early that morning, as if the sun had been waiting all night to settle its debt on the flat Texas plain. Wind scratched dry grass against the barbed wire fence line. A convoy of olive-drab trucks rolled past a row of hangars, tires crunching gravel, engines humming like bass under the brighter song of aircraft already in the sky. Dust hung in the air thick as flour. In the open bed of the second truck sat 8 German generals bound for an interrogation camp in Louisiana. The men had been awake since before dawn, sweating in their khaki PW uniforms, their epaulettes long stripped away, but their habits of rank intact. They rode upright even on wooden benches, watching the scenery with curiosity disguised as arrogance. A wind shifted through the truck and carried the sharp scent of aviation fuel. Colonel Friedrich Neumann leaned over to the man beside him, General Ernst Müller, and said in German, "Strange, that fuel is everywhere here like perfume." Müller grunted. "There are many planes," he said. "They build them like ants, build hills. No art, only repetition." Both turned their heads as a yellow training aircraft skimmed low over the convoy, wings flashing white in the glare, before banking neatly away. The roar of its propeller shook dust from the truck's canvas sides. The guards in the lead jeep didn't flinch, just another practice circuit. Of all the unexpected things about America, the prisoners had not yet learned familiarity with noise. In Europe, the sound of engines meant death from above. Here, it meant employment, ambition, and morning routine. The convoy slowed at the edge of a sprawling airfield. Rows of hangars stretched out like tin-topped warehouses. Maintenance crews in coveralls hurried between them. "Avenger Field," read a white-painted sign. Several of the Germans recognized the name from whispered camp gossip, a training center for new pilots. They leaned forward, hoping for any reminder of their former profession. From this vantage, the field stirred like an ant-hill of activity. Twin-engine C-47s idled at the far runway. Smaller trainers zipped overhead, and a jeep towed a fuel truck toward a group of aircraft painted with bright blue stars. The prisoners tracked every motion with the old reflex of professionals. Even stripped of command, their eyes couldn't forget the calculus of logistics: how many planes, how many men, how much fuel. Then something broke that rhythm. One of the smaller trainers rolled out of the bay, taxiing past a row of mechanics. At first, nothing distinguished it until the pilot swung open the canopy. Long hair slipped loose beneath her cap. A woman, slight but confident, climbed into the cockpit, hands moving with practiced precision over the controls. An instructor leaned to her briefly, then stepped back, clipboard tucked beneath his arm. The trainer nosed into the wind and began its takeoff roll. Miller blinked, as if burned. Was that a Frau? The guard overheard and nodded casually. "WASP, Women Air Force Service Pilots. You'll see more." The plane gained speed, lifted clean from the runway, climbing toward the sun until wings flashed silver against flawless blue. Dust whirled into the truck bed, but none of the men noticed. Around them, the world seemed inverted. In their country, women had been ration-line ghosts, factory cogs behind curtains of propaganda. Here, one of them commanded a military aircraft like it was her birthright. Neumann stared after her as the aircraft leveled and banked over the field, her white scarf trailing like smoke. He whispered in English so low the guard barely heard it. They let her fly alone. It wasn't condemnation this time, it was wonder. The convoy idled for a few minutes while the airfield cleared the runway. Above, the yellow trainer wheeled in graceful arcs, its engine note shifting from drone to hum and back again. When it finally descended, the woman landed in perfect alignment, tires kissing the tarmac without a bounce. A line of POWs watched through the truck's dust-streaked canvas window soldiers, taught from birth that femininity and flight could never meet. The general beside Neumann exhaled through his teeth. "In Berlin," he said slowly, "that would be a circus, never a command." Neumann didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the runway, where another woman stepped forward to guide the plane in, with hand signals crisp as any officer's salute. When the engines wound down, silence returned for a heartbeat. Then the guards clambered back into the cab, engines revved, and the convoy moved on, passing a world they couldn't yet explain, but would never forget. One that measured strength not only in steel, but in freedom. By the spring of 1944, skies over the United States were alive with training flights. While Europe still burned, America became a giant classroom of air. Every morning the faint thunder of propellers rolled over Kansas wheat fields, Louisiana marshes, Texas plains. The war effort demanded pilots by the tens of thousands, and then demanded more. To meet that need, the government had done something few nations would have dared. It opened the sky to women. At bases like Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, the women Air Force Service pilots WASP trained in khaki coveralls and leather helmets, carrying flight manuals under their arms just like any male cadet. They were civilians on paper, but military in every rhythm of the day. Reveille at dawn, check flights before breakfast, maintenance inspections after dusk. Some had grown up milking cows or teaching grade school. Others had learned to fly in dim little air clubs before the Depression. Now they towed gunnery targets across vast horizons, ferried fighters between factories and bases, and tested repaired aircraft before men flew them in combat. Their code was simple. We live to serve, and we serve to fly. It was all the more astonishing because the program barely fit inside its own time. The same America that still printed job ads segregated by gender now handed flight controls to 20-year-olds named Betty, Helen, and Dora. Inside each yellow-painted trainer, those contradictions melted under necessity. If a woman could handle a stick and rudder as precisely as any man, and many could, there was no argument worth having. That reality never crossed the borders of Nazi Germany. Back there, the function of woman had been molded into propaganda and motherhood. Even the regime's favorite female pilot, Hannah Reich, had been treated more as spectacle than colleague a mascot for male engineering, proof that feminine grace could serve but never command. The generals who rode through Sweetwater carried those assumptions like luggage: discipline, power, technology. They were hierarchies arranged by sex as well as rank. The POW camps built across Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma were meant to house such men, but also in curious ways to re-educate them through experience. They read American newspapers, worked in cotton fields, heard jazz on the guards' radios. The lessons came sideways, democracy's confidence hiding beneath its informality. They could forgive their enemies' prosperity, even its industry. What jarred them most, what dislocated something deeper, was its casual equality. That April morning at Avenger Field unfolded as routine. You could smell oiled metal, hot valves, aviation gasoline. The sun flared against the propeller discs, turning the airfield into a mirror of motion. At every hangar door, flight crews checked maps spread over the hoods of jeeps. A windsock thrashed like a flag of warning and pride. Out on the perimeter road, Army vehicles brought daily supplies, and, that day, a convoy of German officers scheduled for transit. Their arrival was coincidence. Their revelation was destiny. From their truck beds, the prisoners saw a rhythm that defied any military manual they'd ever studied. Commanders in slacks, instructors without swagger, aviators in lipstick laughing as they adjusted seat straps, all working, efficient, unafraid. No grand speeches, no banners. Just the quiet sound of competence. For the Germans, whose civilization had once defined masculinity as authority and technology as male dominion, the sight was a kind of mirror, cracked and re-silvered. The guards, young men barely out of high school, held the pride of familiarity. For them, women flying was just the day's background music. They had sisters building engines in Wichita, wives riveting B-17 wings in Seattle, mothers keeping schools open. The boundaries between gender and contribution blurred naturally, not ideologically. "That's just how it works here," one GI told a bewildered officer who asked if the airfield was a publicity stunt. "She flies. You dig ditches. We all do our jobs." When the convoy finally rolled away, the scene behind them kept echoing. The sunlight flashes from propellers, a woman's deliberate hand over throttle, the high-pitched whistle of wings slicing into the dry blue ceiling of Texas. The Germans sank into silence, each nursing a separate disbelief. They could accept engines without wonder. They could not accept liberty behind the controls. The truck carrying the German officers rattled away from Avenger Field, raising a trail of tan dust that glowed in the evening sun. Not one of them spoke. Wind streamed through the open slats, hot with the smell of sage and engine oil, but everyone kept their cap pressed against their knees, as if in mourning for certainty. Inside the truck, General Ernst Miller finally broke the quiet. "A performance," he declared flatly in German, "for propaganda. Surely no army would entrust a bomber or even a trainer to a woman." The others murmured agreement, grateful for the stability of denial. But Colonel Friedrich Neumann shook his head. "You saw her controls." "No instructor touched them. She landed in cross-wind," whispered Weber, the engineer. "There was skill." The guards riding in the jeep ahead couldn't hear the debate, but they would later say they could feel its vibration, the restless silence of men watching their convictions come unbolted. Later that week, at Camp Hearn, a guard named Corporal Jenkins pinned an English newspaper to the mess hall board. "WASP flyer ferries new. P-51 to California base." A grainy photograph showed the pilot helmet cocked jauntily, polished aircraft behind her. The Germans crowded close. Someone translated aloud, stumbling, "Women deliver fighters nationwide. Army crediting WASP for efficient service." For a moment, no one laughed. Finally, Muller snorted. "The Americans waste men at the front, then let women risk the machines." "Lunacy. What if it is wisdom?" Weber asked softly. "She serves efficiency, not vanity." Even the guard looked startled by his tone. That evening, under sodium lights near the wire, Neumann sat on a bench facing Corporal Jenkins. They had formed a habit of trading cigarettes for small talk. The colonel lifted his chin toward the sky, where the late training planes still droned, invisible. "Do people here truly approve?" he asked in careful English. "Approve?" Jenkins shrugged. "Don't see why not." "They fly better than some of our fellas." "In Germany," Neumann replied, "they would call it chaos, a nation out of order." Jenkins glanced upward. "You might call it trust." The colonel looked away, tracing the outline of the razor wire under moonlight. 2 weeks later, a liaison officer from the U.S. Air Transport Command visited the camp to speak with local farmers and officials. He arrived by plane flown not by himself, but by a WASP lieutenant named Gene Davis. As the aircraft touched down on the makeshift strip near the compound, prisoners gathered at the fence lines automatically, curiosity overpowering discipline. They watched her climb down, helmet under arm, laughing with the ground crew. She wore standard khaki flight overalls, the same as any male pilot, streaks of dust marking her cheeks. When the liaison saluted her, they heard him say, "Appreciate the smooth landing, ma'am." The title, "ma'am," rang over the field like a verdict. It was unthinkable, one of the generals recalled years later, that anyone, man or woman, would salute what we had been taught to despise. That night, back inside the barracks, Neumann sat at a small writing table and drew in his notebook, a simple sketch of an aircraft, then a feminine silhouette beside it. He wrote beneath, "Authority without arrogance." Across the room, Weber paced, muttering half aloud. "For 4 years we sent boys to die for machines like that. Now women fly them for transport. and Liv Mueller, sitting on the lower bunk, offered the last brittle defense. They do it because Americans can afford experiment. Neumann closed his notebook, or because their freedom survived its testing. Work detail the next morning took them past Army mechanics patching trucks. Among them was a woman in grease-stained overalls repairing a carburetor. She wiped her hands on a rag, nodded politely to the passing prisoners, and returned to her tools. The guards noticed none of this. The Germans saw nothing else. Something subtle shifted how they straightened their backs, how their gaze held respect instead of novelty. Over the following months, rumors of women in uniform multiplied: nurses, clerks, drivers, code specialists, pilots. At first, the Germans dismissed the stories. Later, they began remembering names: Riley, Davis, Colvin. They spoke of technique and professionalism, not scandal. Admiration had found its footing. In October, a thunderstorm rolled across central Texas. POWs worked to secure tarps over camp trucks. Above the din of rain, thunder mixed with a distant humming and approaching craft. A small training plane bobbed through clouds, lightning flickering over its fuselage before disappearing westward. One guard said the pilot was probably another WASP finishing her scheduled mail run. Some Germans stopped and listened, silhouettes drenched in rain. Neumann finally spoke, voice almost a whisper. She fights the storm alone. And America lets her. No one replied. Only the rhythmic drumming of rain filled the pause where past certainty had once existed. When the aircraft noise faded, Mueller turned toward Neumann. "The Reich taught us strength," he said. "Perhaps freedom breeds a different kind." The words hung awkwardly, yet no one contradicted him. From mockery to silence, disbelief to reluctant respect, the arc had completed itself. The paradox of that Texas sky women at the helm, while generals watched from behind fences, had rewritten hierarchies faster than any re-education officer could. When the war finally ended, spring returned to the Texas plains, as if the earth itself were exhaling. Green crept back into the mesquite, and engines at local airfields quieted from constant roar to occasional hum. One morning, freight trucks backed up along the POW compound's gate. The guards called roll, announced transfers. The captured generals were going home, or what was left of it. The convoy moved east toward Galveston through wind that smelled faintly of salt. Across those same skies where they had once seen women flying, sunlight flashed on the wings of scattered training planes. Each flash became a signal, each sound a reminder. Their bodies were leaving, but the memory stayed oxygen mixed with shock, forever welded to that first time they'd looked up and seen freedom wearing a leather flight jacket. When their ship reached Bremerhaven weeks later, Germany lay gray and gutted. Ruins smoked where avenues had once marched in perfection, rail tracks buckled, cranes like skeletons in the harbor wind. As the men disembarked, Colonel Friedrich Neumann pocketed a weathered photograph torn from an old magazine, a WASP smiling beside a P-51. He had taken it from a camp bulletin board. He realized he could not bring its simplicity home. To his countrymen, the idea of women pilots would sound as mythic as Atlantis. In the following months, while Reconstruction limped forward, the former officers spoke quietly among themselves in cafes that smelled of diluted coffee. They knew their old vocabulary of order no longer fit the new world forming beyond the rubble. Weber, the engineer, said it first. "In Texas, I saw a woman command a machine without needing permission. If we had learned that, perhaps we could have commanded ourselves." The others nodded, realizing the statement wasn't rebellion anymore, it was reason. A British journalist visiting occupied Hamburg later recorded an interview with one of the returning generals. He confessed, "We called America mechanical, soulless. But what we saw were souls united by mechanics." He described the WASPs, eyes bright, jackets stained with oil, and admitted they had dismantled something larger than doctrine. his certainty that discipline must always equal domination. When the article ran, it disappeared quickly in the tide of post-war stories, but a few readers clipped the piece and tucked it away. Years later, across the ocean, Avenger Field reverted to farmland. The hangars stood ghostly and silent until they were torn down for scrap. But each spring, locals claimed to hear engines faintly on the wind-imagined echoes of the WASPs who once circled overhead. In Germany, Neumann kept the old magazine photo pinned above his desk through years of reconstruction work. Visitors often asked if she was family. He would shake his head, no. She reminds me how wrong we were about strength. By the 1950s, women across Europe began filling university laboratories and aviation schools. West Germany's first civilian female pilots took to the air in the new democracy's colors. Most never knew who their earliest admirers had been, defeated officers haunted by one bright April morning in Texas. Freedom, they had learned, was not chaos, it was competence shared by all who dared. Back in America, the surviving members of the WASP program quietly folded their wings when the Army disbanded the organization in late 1944. They returned to office jobs and kitchens, unheralded until decades later. But somewhere across the Atlantic, men they'd never met used them as evidence that a nation's character could be measured by who it allowed to touch its machines. Factories rebuilt, families relearned civility, and somewhere deep in memory, an engine turned air moving across spinning blades, synonymous now not with war, but with equality. When Neumann died in 1963, his family found among his papers a line written in faded pencil: "Power, once divided, multiplies." It was perhaps the truest translation of what he had witnessed that day at Avenger Field, the visible proof that liberty's arithmetic did not subtract strength but expanded it. Civilized nation shows its confidence not by keeping power, but by sharing it. And sometimes the boldest revolution is not declared in speeches, but flown quietly to altitude by hands once thought unworthy of flight.